Well, we ended our Wednesday evening class with studying of Ezekiel. Of course, our quarters changed, so we're switching from Romans to Ezekiel this morning. And we pick up one of the longest chapters in the Bible, where we read of how God looked at Israel. I think it's very informative. We have some questions concerning that. But what we see in that 16th chapter, those 60 some odd verses, what way were the Canaanites Israel's mother and father? And we touched on that a little bit Wednesday night. But I want us to kind of clarify that if you have any questions about that. How would they be? So it sets a historical place. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, did they trod the land of Canaan before they went into Egypt? That's true. Abraham came from Mesopotamia. But what God says here is that here was your mother and your father. And we notice that was the Ammonite and Hittite. We see in this chapter. He describes that as being who they are. And they were of the land of Canaan. What we're looking at is the birth of a nation. They had the law of Moses. As they were in the wilderness, they came into a new land of Canaan, and so forth. They had the promised land. They became a new nation. And the Canaanites despised them. And that sets the stage of what we see here in Ezekiel, the 16th chapter, that he looks at, he wants the people of Judah now in Babylonian captivity, the Israelites, to understand where they came from. And you'll stress in this chapter, remember the days of your youth. And we see God as being a husband who cares for a new nation, and how ungrateful the people of Israel are to God, who in this case is her husband. So with those thoughts in mind, we begin to see the idea of who the father and mother are, and it's connected with the land of Canaan. The Amorite was thy father, and thy mother was a Hittite. These were the two main tribes of land of Canaan in that area. So you have that setting, that's your mother and father. And what we noticed last week, what did their mother and father, the strong tribes of Canaan, did they love Israel or did they hate Israel? Yes, as a mother and father would expose them to the heat of the wilderness. Her cord was not cut properly. She was left to bleed to death, as if she was a born daughter to a family, father and mother, and they just rejected her. They left her out there to die, and it says, verse 5, no one pitied thee to do any of these things unto them, to have compassion upon thee, but thou wast cast out in the open field, for that thy person was abhorred in the day that thou wast born. Nation being born. Canaanites, their background, despised them as they became a nation serving God. And if we make it, well, this is where Abraham came from. Abraham would trod there, but he was from Mesopotamia. But this makes sense with the idea of being a nation, because the nation is being judged. Remember, Ezekiel is prophesying to people who are already in Babylonian captivity. What they've been taught is that Jerusalem will not be destroyed. That's a lie. Saw that in the 13th chapter. All of that is false teaching, that they will be back in a couple of years. That prophet realized in 7 months he was dead, that was false teaching. And that's the background we're having. So here's the ungratefulness. And you think, how does God want his people to see him? And here's his people. And you might think, well, God, that's kind of small of you. But it's showing the reality, and he's stressing that which you and I would be very angry if our spouse treated us the way that Israel treated her husband, God. And that's what he wants to drive home to them. So here's the beginning of the Canaanites and the Amorite and the Hittite, question number 12. Now, we asked the question, how does God show his care for Israel? We just kind of hit on that. He saw you in all your blood, and he did not allow you to die. He came and took care of you. No one pitied thee, that sort of thing. So what he does in verses 7 is, when I passed by thee and saw thee suffering in thy, or weltering in the heat, weltering in thy blood, and said, though thou art in thy blood, yet I'm coming unto thee. And so what does he do? I swallowed thee, I took care of you. But now we see in these verses where the young girl is alive and she matures and she becomes a woman of marrying age. And that's what we see take place unto thee. And so what he did in verse 11, I spread my skirt over thee and covered thy nakedness. I'm going to be your husband. And it wasn't just the sexual relationship. He's making a covenant of marriage, for he says, I spread my skirt over thee and covered thy nakedness, and I swear unto thee and entered into a covenant with thee, saith the Lord Jehovah, and thou becamest mine. There's the husband aspect. And so he takes care of her. She becomes of marrying age in the days of love, if we see here in this set forth there. And he took her, and we see that the intimacy of the marriage relationship of the husband and the wife. So he took care of her there, but how does he take care of her now as a bride? And really, he begins to crown her as a queen. What is her clothes like? Linen. All these things. And these become important because we'll see in the next paragraph how she uses them. But he's caring for her, dressing her well. It said, and thy renown went forth among the nations, verse 14, for thy beauty, for it was perfect, mean complete, though through my majesty which I had upon thee, saith the Lord Jehovah. He's laying the groundwork of how much she did not care for her husband, or what he's done for her. And so verses 8 through 14, we begin to see how he decked her out in the marvelous attire. So we get that thought in mind. And now we see what happens beginning with verse 15. So I want to stop here and ask this question. What two facts of marriage are emphasized in God's relationship with Israel? So you read the rest of the chapter, and we're beginning here. They're married, well taken care of. But what two facts of marriage do you see? We've already read it already. What was it? It's just a relationship. We're going to get together and have the sexual relationships, and we'll call it marriage. What does he do? He makes a covenant. That's a promise from God the Father, and he's going to honor that. And that's what we see in a marriage relationship, don't we? We have two people, man and a woman, we got to emphasize that today, that have a right to one another, that are not divorced, and all those things we see Jesus talking about. But that relationship is a covenant between two people. Now, what do? Do you negotiate? Some do. Got a lot of money, you better get say that you're not going to share my money that I already have. Rich people do that. But the rest of us, we make promises. What do we say in a formal marriage ceremony? Officiated by either the judge, maybe he will, maybe he won't, but the preacher. You have vows. And I'm going to be faithful unto you. I'm going to love you even to times of good, bad, sickness, health. All those things promised to be there. We're making promises as a covenant. That's just not a sexual relationship. It is a commitment. It's not just living together. It's a commitment of being, and it's interesting to me, no longer man and woman in Genesis 2, but you cleave to your what? Wife. She's a woman. Husband is to leave his father and mother. I mean, the man's supposed to leave his father and mother, cleave to his wife. And what we become is that anyone that has a husband, let her indeed show unto him his due. We have man and woman created in Genesis 2, but when we leave for chapter 3, we have a husband and wife. And that's a different relationship than just a sexually available male or female. And that's how God entered it. Now, so there's a sense of a covenant, and then what was the big problem? They were not what to that covenant? They were not faithful. Two parts of marriage that we see here, God said it was a covenant, promise, we're going to follow your law, and they were not faithful because God demands faithfulness. Do not we demand faithfulness in our marriage relationships? We must. That's why we formed that. That's a foundation for the home. We're going to raise children from that relationship. It gives them a foundation, a male figure, a female figure, and the security. I mean, you can't make a better situation for the reality that men and women have babies and so forth. You can't do that. So there's that relationship that's being set forth there. And I want those two things to underscore here that we'll see in this particular section. And what we'll see how unfaithful Israel was. So we begin to notice that. Any questions or comments about that? All right. Question number 15. What was the first step in the downfall of Israel as a faithful wife? She just looked up and honored her husband, who is God. What did she do?
Verse 15 said she trusted in her beauty.
She trusted in her beauty. I'm looking good. How'd you look good? Why are you even living to become a marriageable age woman? And then I clothed you with the finest of a crown. You're a queen. You're envied among the nations because of your law. And he says forth here, you trusted in your own beauty. So what happens? She's going to use her beauty to entice her lovers. And that's going to be what? We'll talk about the lovers, but it's going to be how was Israel unfaithful to God? We're looking at the imagery of a husband and wife relationship and sexual relationship, being unfaithful sexually to your promise and so forth. And we begin to be introduced to these, but the point is that she is using her beauty to entice others to join in her, allowing her to be unfaithful to God. And what would be one thing, if you didn't read the rest of this chapter, what would be one thing that God would say, you've been unfaithful to me as your husband? What was the harlotry taking place? What were that God does allow? And he's a jealous God over what, David? Idolatry. That's right. They're worshiping their man-made idols. And so she's involved in having her idolatry. Is that why the northern kingdom was destroyed? Is that not why the southern kingdom was destroyed? In the sense of punishment of Assyria, a punishment of Babylon. And it's as if you went off and had lovers, and here you're left as a husband. I've seen that in real life, how hurtful that is to a husband. It was a church I was in, and the wife was unfaithful to the husband and left him, and we were there as a church to try to support him. What do you say? How can you come? It hurts so deeply because there is the trust that you have, the openness that you have, even the nakedness, and all of that, and you have just thrown it up, disregarded it. And it's hard to mend that relationship back, isn't it? It's hurt so much. What is the one reason that God allows for divorce? Only one. Adultery. Fornication, he says in Matthew 19:9. If you do that and you join to another woman, you commit adultery. But if for that reason he gave, why is that? Because that hits the deepest of a person, and God allowed that. If that's the reason they went off, that's the reason that you can put them away. Otherwise, what God has joined together, let not man do what? But you can't put it asunder. And you're not to separate that. So we try to live by that. Well, that's God has always wanted that. And he was trying to say, here, we entered a covenant, and this is what you did. So that unfaithfulness is there. She trusted in her own beauty. Not trusting in God. She trusts in her own beauty. Number 16, how is Israel worse than a prostitute?
A prostitute at least receives pay for her sin, but in verse 31 they didn't even receive a benefit from it.
All right, and what did she... That's right, didn't receive a benefit, but what does she do with all of her beautiful clothes? She bribes her lovers, doesn't she? You see that? That's what makes it worse. It's worse than what you're saying, that here she shows her beauty to others, but they would at least give, a prostitute would be hired. She gave the money. She gave all of her devotion and her clothes. Notice what it says, verse 17, dost thou also take the fair jewels of my gold and of my silver? What about the broader garments in verse 18? All the things he gave her, you did that. And what is done, you've given that to your lovers. And therefore you're worse than a prostitute. She receives from her lovers that want to have sex with her. You are worse than a prostitute. Not only that you've done, but you're the one that gave money to them. That's how God looks at it. And he said in verse 22, thou abominations, thou whoredoms, thou hast not remembered the days of thy youth, when thou wast naked and bare and waste watering in the blood. And it says, and it came to pass after all the wickedness, woe unto thee, thy Lord said, thou hast built unto thee the exalted place, or the vaulted place, and hast made the lofty place in every place, in every street. And thou hast built thy ivory place in the head of every way. So there's idolatry, the beauty of the beauty, and destroy that in abomination, and has opened thy feet. There's a sexual relationship being talked about, being passed by, and committed the whoredom. And so then he begins to talk about who his lovers are. But the point is that, as you'll see with this, you're worse than the others. Who were then Israel's lovers?
Egyptians, Assyrians, Chaldeans.
I think those are three that are mentioned in this text. The Egyptians and the Assyrians. Let's talk about them for a second. Remember, we've studied Jeremiah, and we've noticed that in Jeremiah there is indeed when the people wanted to have protection, instead of turning to God a lot of times, they were turning to the hand of powers that had an army, had horses in Egypt. And we could appeal to them to protect us from our enemy instead of God. And so they went up to her as lovers. They would give them the money and pay the price for protection. And she's as a prostitute, but here's the fact that here's the lovers, and they don't have to give you anything. You appealed to them and gave of your riches that God had given to them. And he speaks about that in verse 26, when he says that also committed fornication with Egypt. and my neighbors grated the flesh and so multiply that. Then at verse 28, the Assyrians, because thou was insatiable. You just kept after your lovers. You didn't come back to me, and so forth. And also the idea of the verse 29, thou hast moreover multiplied thy whoredom unto the land of traffic, which Canaan was looked upon as a land of traffic. What I mean, a lot of merchants running through here and there and selling and buying and getting gain. And he's going to apply this term. It even reaches to Chaldea, which is another place of traffic we'll see later in our studies. But it's under the land of traffic. He says, unto Chaldea, and thou wast not satisfied therewith. That they didn't help you, because what happened? Egypt and Assyria took care of the northern kingdom, destroyed it, and Egypt was no help against the Babylonians. And now they're over in Chaldea, draining the ways of the Chaldean gods, as they took from the Egyptian gods and the Assyrian gods, and put them there and paid them money, give them their money in order to have their protection. When God, husband, was to be the protector. And therefore there was that sense of ingratitude, and God is painting that picture of how that was very, very true. How would God use them? You want your lovers? How would God use them? That's right. He goes on to say, all the nations are going to turn upon you. They're not going to protect you. What does Syria do to Israel? Took them into captivity. What are the Chaldeans going to be doing to them? The Chaldeans were going to be their friends. They're going to bring judgment upon them as well. And therefore they're going to be destroyed by their lovers. And that's the horrible thing that's going to happen to them. And that's what they're trying to observe there. All right? All right, the question, let's go. Any comments there? Okay, I'm trying to move on. Who were the two sisters of Jerusalem? So we got this family relationship going. Now she got sister. We got a mother and father. He's going to emphasize that again in the text. But who are the two sisters?
Verse 46 says,
Okay, Samaria and Sodom. Who's the younger sister? You know, he makes that point. It's Sodom. All right, Samaria. We can understand this. Is that not the northern kingdom of Israel? You had those 10 tribes within the northern kingdom of Israel in Samaria. Who was the enemy that took them out in captivity? That's Assyria, about 722 BC. So we can find that. But how is Sodom a sister? Usually when we think of Sodom, we think of sodomy, we think of sexual deviancy, we think of how sinful they were sexually, and it's really we see the homosexual activity taking place in the Old Testament, and we say, well, sodomy. we got the city of Sodom, but who dwelt there? And he should have been there, but he chose it. He pitched his tent or that area. What was his name? Was he connected with Abraham any? His nephew. And what came out of an incestuous relationship with his daughters? You wonder where they learned that. In Sodom. But we have the Ammonites and the Moabites. Those are the children. And what we see is that Sodom indeed was somewhat connected with Israel in the sense of Lot, and learning the deviancy and the perversion that take place. And I think he's using Sodom. Yeah, we think of the sins that Sodom does, but as a sister, she's also related somewhat, because Lot came out of there with all of his influences. Was his wife even also influenced by that culture? I mean, she looked back when she was told not to. She longed for that. Doesn't look like the husbands wanted to go. And the two daughters were left alone. The incestuous relationship with their father takes place. So I think that's the connection we have with them and their children. You have the smaller cities connected with the northern kingdom of Samaria. We have the Ammonites and the Moabites connected with Sodom, because indeed from there is where we find that they had their roots there with Lot and his daughters. And so that's I think those two say, do you understand that? Or make that clear as mud? What? Clear? Okay. That's number 20. How did Israel justify her two sisters? How did Israel justify her two sisters? It's pretty bad, aren't they? It's pretty bad. But how did that mean they weren't okay because they were justified? No. It shows you just how much worse it was than Sodom and Samaria. And how was that? They appear righteous. So my question is, how is that true? What's that?
They were even worse.
All right, how worse? Did they have more opportunity than Sodom had to know God? That's the point. I gave you a covenant. I didn't give that to Sodom. I gave you a covenant, God's people, and you had that and especially Judah, because he's now dealing with the southern kingdom. Judah had the temple in Jerusalem. They had the priest. And the 10 tribes, they had the one true God. And so these Egyptian lovers, these Assyrian lovers, these people that are Samaria and Sodom, they've done bad. But Judah, you're the one that indeed they were connected with God and they knew God, but you especially knew God. That's where the temple was, and that's what is going to be destroyed. And the priests are going to be responsible for that, in the king as well. And you had that closer relationship. You should have done better because you had the opportunity to know better than your sisters. Not that he justified the sisters, and not that one sin's worse than another in the sense of God. Both of them condemns us. But it's the idea of your relationship that you had, that you should have indeed known better. What covenant does God promise to make? So with all of that, God is not going to fully destroy them, is he? And we come to the latter part of this chapter. I will establish my covenant with thee, verse 62, and there you shall know that I am Jehovah, and thou be made to remember to be and be confounded, and I'll never open my mouth anymore because of thy shame. He said enough. When I have forgiven thee all that thou hast done, saith the Lord Jehovah. This judgment it's going to be horrible that comes upon Jerusalem. And we're just about 5 years away when this prophecy was given, that was going to happen. And it's a discipline. It hurts. And you say, well, God, they just destroyed everything. He calls it discipline. Because what? They're not annihilated, are they? There's going to be a remnant that comes from all of this, and I'll give them a different spirit, because discipline gives you a different spirit. And they're going to serve God. They're going to have an opportunity to do that. The northern kingdom, they don't come back as the southern kingdom does. But that southern kingdom comes back to establish Jerusalem, and we'll pick up there. But Ezekiel's long chapter, it's the longest one in this book, that it's about my faithfulness to my wife and her unfaithfulness. And when you hold that up to us, we say, that's horrible. Well, that's how horrible it was for them to turn to idols and turn to nations that couldn't protect them. And what we're going to see in this next lesson is the parable of the two eagles and little twigs being planted and nourished. And we're going to try to make sense out of that as well. And that'll be lesson number 5 next time. And that will start a section of 17 through 24. Any questions you have for today? We moved pretty early. Okay, thank you for being here and participating.